This is what you would see if it wasn't for the hard-working volunteers at Channel 10. But thanks to their great effort, this is what you get.
Good evening. I'm Irene Mock, a local member of Conscience Canada, and with me tonight are Natalie Voykin, who is from the USCC, the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ, a Doukhobor organization, and my husband, David Planedin. We all say we want to live in a peaceful world, and some people question where their tax money goes and whether or not it contributes to peace or promotes violence. Last year, the Canadian government spent close to $13 billion on the military, weapons of destruction and training of people to kill. If you are at all like me, at tax time you may feel helpless, knowing your dollars fuel the killing machine. But there is an option. You can pay taxes for peace. Tonight, we'll be showing you the video, Your Money or Your Life, a dialogue on conscientious objection, which will run for about a half hour. And stay with us afterwards for a discussion.
Faster! Come on! Come on! Yeah, I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you. Kill you. Here we go! Here we go! Yes! 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 Come on! Come on! Come on! Kill him! Come on! Gonna die! Die! Come on! Hit him! Yeah! Okay. Not bad, eh? Your turn.
No, thanks. I'm not playing.
Why not? It's neat.
I don't want to kill, and I don't want to fight.
Hey, it's only a game.
War isn't a game. I don't like it. I don't want to be a part of war.
Well, what are you? Some kind of a peacenik or something?
You could call me a pacifist. I know I'm a conscientious objector.
Oh, what?
Who do we know who is a conscientious objector? How do we describe one? A conscientious objector is one who, on religious or moral convictions, objects to warfare and refuses to bear arms or perform military service. Moral convictions. Do we all have them? Do we all have a conscience? What is conscience? Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher of the 18th century, wrote,
"Conscience is an instinct, to judge ourselves in the light of moral laws. It is not a mere faculty, it is an instinct."
And Albert Einstein said,
"What constitutes an immoral act can be determined only by one's own individual conscience."
Do we Canadians act according to our consciences? Do we share a common sense of right or wrong, moral and immoral? For some Canadians, participating in war is seen as being patriotic, honorable, a duty to be performed with pride. Others deplore any act of violence and look to the Constitution for leadership. In the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Canadians are guaranteed freedom of conscience and religion. For some individuals, their religion helps them define that sense of right or wrong, and their willingness to act according to their consciences.
I wonder if God can really hear me. Hey, God, what should I do with my life?
Feed the hungry, right injustice, work for peace.
Just testing.
Same here.
To many, concerns for the environment shape their beliefs and convictions. To some, preservation of human life is the focus. Some trace the development of conscience back to the will to survive, for killing and destruction can only lead to our own death. So, under Canadian law, are we free to act according to our consciences? No. No, there is no provision for conscientious objectors in Canadian law, and no country has adequate legislation to provide protection for conscientious objectors who are already in the military, although the UN Human Rights Committee has it under discussion. And to the government, they pose a threat to power, to order, and to the economic policies that support the military and the structure of their defense strategies.
There's a pretty big group that wants to put a stop to war.
I know. They're called taxpayers.
Dr. Jerry Lynn Pryor, Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of BC, is one of those taxpayers. Dr. Pryor is a recipient, along with her colleagues, of the Nobel Peace Prize, and she holds an award for her action. Research in the field of social justice, including peace work, contributing significantly to the advancement of women in Canada. Her convictions are clear.
I'm a conscientious objector because I cannot participate in any way, directly or indirectly, in violence against other people, whether the state says that violence is okay, in other words, in a war, or whether it's in my neighborhood or in my home.
Another is Edith Adamson, co-founder of Conscience Canada, a librarian and historian who devotes her life to bringing about a change in the Canadian law for conscientious objectors.
Well, I'm a conscientious objector, and for me, that means that I cannot do something or anything which contradicts my conscientious beliefs and principles.
Muriel Sibley, a ceramic artist, a wife and mother, a Quaker who flew to Iraq during the Gulf War to join the International Peace Camp.
When I heard that this peace camp was being set up on the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, of people from all over the world who were as concerned about war as I was and who were willing to put their bodies on the line in between, a tangible saying, stop, to the world. Stop this madness. I was moved very, very strongly to go.
And Jason Miller is the first Canadian to obtain honorable discharge from the military as a conscientious objector since World War II. Now active in the work to preserve the environment, Jason explains.
I had become politically active while I was in the military in the peace movement, you know, because I'm interested more in peace and these issues, and to me it seemed that the peace groups were saying much saner things than the military, right? And also Victoria is a city where there's a long history of the peace movement, and so it's really interesting. But that's to be involved in the peace movement while in the military is illegal on the book.
Jason had become aware of the meaning of conscience in his life.
It means conscience, to me, is the inner truth. It's not so much a matter of what is right or wrong, but what is, what is important for me to be doing.
And being in the Navy, Jason could no longer do what they asked of him, so he objected. Anyone who is in the military is trained to kill, to obey orders without question. The government orders the generals, and the generals order the soldiers. And then the monuments go up, the wreaths are laid, the rituals are held to honor the dead soldiers. But what about all those civilians who died because of war? Statistics show that for every soldier, 10 civilians die in war. In Europe, in the 18th century, various countries brought in conscription laws, for the first time in the history of the world, making military service mandatory, though many were against such a law. Quakers, Mennonites, Hutterites, and other religious groups in the Anabaptist tradition held beliefs that forbade them to kill, and so they, as members of these peace churches, were exempt, though they had to accept some alternate service. Others, who objected to conscription, faced court-martials, local tribunals, and even imprisonment for up to 5 years. In Canada, during World War II, the government had conscription powers too, and exemptions were granted for those with religious affiliation with the established peace churches. But enough conscientious objectors to military service on other grounds lobbied, and in 1942 they too were granted alternate service. Since 1793, Canada's peace church groups, particularly the Quakers and Mennonites, have presented a tradition of support for those who objected to war. And so it was in the 1970s when Canada was seen to be a safe haven for conscientious objectors to the military in the United States in their war in Vietnam. Objection to war became a common topic for conversation.
Okay, you don't believe in killing. Have you any religious or moral objections to being killed?
Canada wasn't at war, and Canadians were lulled into a comforting pride in the role of Canada as a peacekeeping nation. Until 1991. Jason Miller's requests for honorable discharge from the Navy had met only obstacles, and for him, public reaction to the war was unbelievable.
I was from the military, and I spoke out against the war publicly during the war. Because there's one thing the military fears, really fears, and that is that the troops become disloyal. That's really what they fear the most, and they figure that is mutiny and treason.
Jason Miller was granted an honorable discharge from the Navy, ironically in wartime, though he had struggled for it in times of peace, so that he could be free to work for peace, so that he could march to a different drum. A few other young conscientious objectors, like Jason Miller, have been discharged from the military, though there is no status for them under the Canadian Defense Act. In the United States, some 2,500 men and women filed their conscientious objection to the Gulf War. About 1,000 of them have been imprisoned. Amnesty International has adopted their cases. At the same time that Canada's troops were being prepared to depart for the war, another departure went almost unnoticed. Muriel Sibley was leaving Victoria, BC to fly to the war zone in Iraq, but without weapons.
And then I got onto a plane, and I think I cried all the way to Boston. Strangely enough, I became aware of the conversation of the people in the seat next to me, the seats. It turned out they were arms manufacturers and congratulating themselves on what a good fall it had been. And I remember thinking to myself through my depression, I really should talk to them. I really should confront them. If I live according to conscience, this is what I should do. But I must say I wasn't able to do it at that point. I was only able to think about my own sadness at leaving my family.
It's funny, just talking about it always brings back the strong, very strong emotions. I don't think either of us are particularly brave people, but we just felt really committed to do something. So she went, and I stayed behind. And it wasn't too long after being here that I realized how hard it is for all those people that are left behind.
In Boston, I met up with 13 Americans, and we traveled from there to Jordan. In Jordan, we met up with a group of Germans and a group of English and a few Indians. And then we went from there by plane to Baghdad. And in Baghdad, we got on a bus and went for about 8 hours across the desert and arrived at the peace camp at 2 in the morning on January 15th. We were just in time for the deadline, George Bush's deadline. There were, at that time, 80 or 90 people at the peace camp from 20 countries. All kinds of languages, all kinds of cultures. It was quite beautiful and overwhelming to me to see all these individuals, aged 19 to 82, who had made this trek, many of them from farther away than I did, to stand for something that they believed in. After the war began, we were out of communication with anybody for about 10 days. And then an Iraqi official came and told us that for our own safety we were going to be moved out of the country. We didn't know where. We thought we might be taken perhaps to Iran, perhaps to Turkey, perhaps to Jordan. But we were kindly and firmly told to get into buses, and we were moved with all our baggage, with all our food, out of the camp, which had become, after 12 days, a community. And maybe that's one of the most important things I came away with. That all those different people from all those different cultures, with many different languages, many different lifestyles, could make a community. The only thing we had in common, really, was an opposition to this war. And I saw, again, what war does to any place, and realized more deeply than ever how wrong it was, how ludicrous it was to try to solve problems this way.
Opposition to the Gulf War was evident, and the sense of powerlessness was seen among the civilians waiting at home in Canada. The cost of this technological extravaganza escalated, and paying taxes for war meant paying the soldier to kill. One woman set out on a course to find an alternative to paying for war. Edith Adamson.
I try my best to avoid participating in violence in any way, and instead emphasize peaceful alternatives.
And her alternative was to organize a peace tax movement in Canada, similar to those she had discovered existed in the United States and Britain, to find a way to redirect taxes to peace rather than to war. She and a few other Quakers met in Victoria, BC, and in 1978, a Canadian peace tax movement began.
We began writing letters to the government, asking, this is before the charter, remember, but asking that the principle of conscientious objection to military service be extended to the tax field. And we got the same answer that we're getting today. There's no provision in the Income Tax Act for you to be exempt from paying more taxes, which is ridiculous because we wouldn't be asking for one if there were. But we were all ready on the 17th of April, 1982. The Queen signed the Charter and signed the new Constitution Act, including the Charter. And then we had 60 people already to direct their taxes to peace.
The Income Tax Department's reaction was mixed and at times vindictive. She describes the case of a Mennonite who asked that his taxes be redirected to peace.
And Revenue Canada billed him for the money he had on deposit in the Peace Tax Fund. He wrote and said, I cannot give you this money, I cannot send you this money, it is contrary to my conscience and religion. And instead of taking it from his bank account, they stopped his old age pension, his Canada pension plan, and they told the dealer in Saskatoon not to pay him for farm produce that he had sold to them.
But the idea of resistance to paying taxes for war is not new. In her book, For Conscience Sake, Edith gives a concise history of the movement as far back as 412 BC. The Greek playwright Aristophanes wrote a play in which the heroine, Lysistrata, gives an early example of war tax resistance.
We want to keep the money safe and stop you from waging war.
The war has nothing to do with money.
Hasn't it? Why are Pyasander and the other office seekers always stirring things up? Isn't it so they can take a few more dips in the public purse? Well, as far as we're concerned, they can do what they like. Only they're not laying their hands on the money in there.
Why? What are you going to do?
Do? Why, we'll be in charge of it.
You, in charge of our finances?
Well, what's so strange about that? We've been in charge of all your housekeeping finances for years.
But that's not the same thing.
Why not?
Because the money here is needed for the war.
Ah, but the war is not necessary.
And in the 4th century AD, when Emperor Constantine established the Church of Rome, those Christians who refused to pay for Caesar's wars were protected from martyrdom under the just war dogma. In England in 1197, Sir Hugh, the Baron of Lincoln, refused to contribute to King Richard's foreign wars. The history of the peace churches is full of stories of objection to paying taxes for war, including those of many Quakers like William Penn. And in the last century, in 1846, the well-known American philosopher, pacifist, and author, Henry David Thoreau, refused to pay his taxes and was put in jail.
Emerson. Thoreau, my friend. Why are you in jail? Why are you not in jail? If 1,000 men and women were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure, as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood.
These words have inspired many advocates of nonviolence and civil disobedience, including Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. And all over the world, peace tax movements are lobbying their governments for legislation to allow them to redirect their taxes to peace. And from her home in Vancouver, BC, Dr. Jerry Lynn Pryor talks about taking this matter through the courts.
I would like to consider conscientious objection to be positive instead of negative. And that means that I affirm my responsibility for my home, my community, my nation, and the broader world community by taking my fair share of part in that world, using my abilities, whatever they may be, and my relationships to make what is positive and peacemaking happen in that world or that community. Initially, Conscience Canada instructed me not to go to court, that it wouldn't be useful. And yet I felt moved to do it. I just was, that was the way the course of things went. And so I got a young articling, just out of articling lawyer to act for me. And the two of us went to court very bravely.
The first court hearing was difficult and in many ways frustrating.
And when the judge, 9 months later, quoted the Bible and said the Bible told me to pay to Caesar and what was owed to Caesar, I really felt offended that the judge was telling me what my religion said I should do. And that was just the beginning of a long series of disillusionments with the court system.
But disillusioned or not, Dr. Pryor proceeded with her action to test her freedom of conscience and religion.
Because we've just recently gotten a Charter of Rights, bringing the issue of freedom of conscience and religion to the court makes it a test case. In other words, this is an issue where my religious freedom is being impinged upon by government, and this is a place in which the government has a responsibility, the court system has a responsibility to flesh out, what does it mean, freedom of conscience? What does it mean, freedom of religion? And yet, the courts universally have sidestepped that issue, have taken no responsibility for fleshing out what the Charter really means. And it comes down, ironically, cynically, to my way of thinking that it's basically to make us feel good and not really affect our freedoms in this country. This Charter of Rights is a piece of paper if we can't test it in court.
Dr. Pryor was denied her hearing at the Supreme Court of Canada, and her counsel, Thomas Berger, has succeeded in placing it before the UN Human Rights Committee. Lobbyists in some communities have held demonstrations to ask the public to cast a vote for war or peace. They've dubbed it the loony poll.
This is the piece bucket right here.
And many posters express concern over this issue. Although 17 billion is not an accurate figure today, the concern is that war and preparation for war takes such a slice of the budget that there's never enough for education, food, adequate shelter, or health care.
Even though the tensions between East and West are waning, we must continue our military buildup to guard against a new enemy we now have reason to fear.
Who's that?
The billions of people worldwide whose hunger and poor health could have been prevented had we not wasted our resources with a military buildup in the first place.
And what do we say to our children? Do we teach them it's wrong to fight while they're children, and that it's okay for adults, nations to wage war to settle conflicts? Is our adult behavior the example they follow? For them to change, we must change. We can work towards a climate of peace for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. We can write our government to tell them about our objection to war. We can find alternatives to war toys for our children.
Got a toy that does a negotiated settlement?
We can live in consideration of the needs of others. Without aid, they will die of disease. We can support Conscience Canada and find out how to redirect our taxes to peace. We can be ambassadors for peace. We can create a climate for peace. Just think, it takes only one snowflake to bend the limb of a tree. As Norman Cousins said, nothing is more powerful than an individual acting out of his or her own conscience.
This video has been shown across Canada as part of a national campaign to make Canadians aware of Conscience Canada. Various peace groups, as well as the Canadian Institute for Peace and Security, contributed to it. Natalie, I'd like to ask you, what motivated your interest in Conscience Canada?
Well, since I am of the Doukhobor faith, it has been ever since I could remember that the peace issue has been part of our life, and that my grandparents or their parents in 1895 had made a stand against the military, and they have all burnt their firearms at that time. And it's been in my blood, so to speak, that peace is a very important issue, and that we as beings on this planet Earth are responsible for the peace. And it's just, I've always been interested in it. And I do work with the Peace and Disarmament Committee in USCC organization. And I really appreciate you and David being here and working for Conscious Canada and bringing this to the awareness of myself and many others. And I just want to say that the issue of paying taxes is very interesting, because I personally I'm not against paying taxes, but I am against anything that violates my conscience. And sometimes it makes me very angry that I do not have a voice or a say where my tax dollars go. And I would rather have them go for peaceful purposes other than violence and military.
Okay, and David, can I get a sense from you what motivated your interest in Conscience Canada?
Well, like Natalie, I've grown up in a Doukhobor background, and when I first started to hear of the Peace Tax Trust Fund, or the Peace Tax Fund, probably in the early 80s, maybe in 1979 or so on, I started to try to find out more about it. And then what was really interesting was in 1982, the Canadian government came out with a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guaranteed every Canadian citizen freedom of religion and conscience. And while that has not been tested in any way to define exactly what that means, many people felt that the same sort of guarantees that had been given to pacifist groups, like the Quakers or the Doukhobors, the Hutterites, when they first came to Canada and were allowed to act as be conscientious objectors in following with their pacifist beliefs, would also apply to the way we provide money to the government through taxes. And what has basically happened is Conscience Canada has figured out that close to 10%, anywhere from 8 to 10% of our money every year that is paid in federal taxes goes towards the military. And they have set up a trust fund so that people who can't pay taxes for military use can put money into the trust fund until the Canadian government comes out with a fund that can be used for peaceful purposes, either environmental use or peace studies or peace research, you know, something which doesn't violate their beliefs. And it's over the years that I've been following that, and I've been very eager to see how that develops.
Okay, well,
this is very interesting, David, and I understand that you're involved in being you send your taxes to the Conscious Canada Peace Tax Fund. Is that correct?
Well, actually, both Irene and I have done that. Irene was one of the first group of peace tax trusters in 1983 who tested the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in that way. In fact, there were close to 66 people in the first year, and then that number has grown up to almost 500 in the last year or so.
That's across Canada.
Across Canada, yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm just wondering, like, you know, now that we have seen the video and people would be interested to do something along this line, and it would be interesting to know what really was, what was your experience when you started all this?
Well, this is Yes. 1983 was my first year, and I think the percentage then was somewhere around 10 or 12% that went to the military. And what I did was, there's a process which Conscience Canada recommends, or is a kind of usual procedure that a person would follow when they contact Conscience Canada. And it entails writing a check for the military portion. You're not withholding your taxes. You are diverting that portion of your taxes to the trust fund, funds in trust put in by Conscience Canada that cannot be touched. They're just there until the government legally recognizes the trust fund. So I did that. I wrote my check of this percentage of money to Conscience Canada Trust Fund, and the government, Revenue Canada, notified me that I was still owing on my taxes, whereupon I wrote the Minister of Finance and my MP, Lyle Christensen, I think it was him then, I'm not sure who it was then. I have since been very in close contact with Lyle over the whole issue, because there is a private member's bill before the Parliament to introduce a legal peace tax fund. But anyway, so what I did is tell them why I was protesting to my money being used for military purposes. The reaction was astounding. People at Revenue Canada in the office would say, off the record, I agree with what you're doing. They were delighted, but I can't, I have a job here, and I can't, I have to act on orders here, and I have to demand that you pay the money. But we're really behind you. We really like what you're doing. And I got this message consistently, year after year, when I did the peace tax, when I diverted that money. I would get more and more phone calls asking for the money, and at the same time saying, but we agree with you. And it gave me a personal kind of satisfaction that I was putting a little kink in their collection of this military money, but at the same time, there was a connection I was making with these people who ordinarily whose lives I would not ordinarily touch. Another way in which I did this was, one year the money was actually seized from my bank account. The government served me a third-party notice, it's called that. They notified me and my bank manager, and I had 10 days to pay the money or it would be seized from the bank. So I personally got to talk to my bank manager. Now, I would never have talked to my bank manager about these matters, about peace or about my own feelings to do with the world, really, outside of just our banking. But again, it was this nice feeling that I was making a personal connection on a matter of some great importance to me, that I could communicate with this person about something I've been caring deeply about for a long time. And this has been my experience of doing the Peace Tax Fund every year that I could do it. And by could, I mean that I owed the government money so that I could give that percentage of money to the Peace Tax Fund. And each year I feel stronger about doing it. For that reason, I feel more connected to people who probably ordinarily wouldn't have questioned, well, we're paying.
Well, let me ask you now then, when they took your money out of the bank, did you contact Conscience Canada?
Yes.
And they reimbursed you?
This is part of the procedure. These funds are in a trust fund, which means nobody touches them, they stay there. It's acknowledged that as soon as the government takes the money that they can do, and they can do it from either, they can garnish your wages, they can seize the funds out of your bank account, you know, they have their ways to get their tax money. As soon as that happens, you notify Conscience Canada, they refund the money that you've put in the trust fund, put it back in your bank. So in a way, it's a symbolic gesture. I mean, the government will get its money one way or another. But it's an important symbolic gesture because there are two things going on. There's the legal case, the Geraldine Pryor case, and there's also the government's own, the private members bill that's been introduced every year and has been since 1983 when Jim Manley first introduced it. So we're working on both the judicial, legal grounds as well as the political front.
Well, do you feel now that this issue has kind of moved ahead in terms of awareness and consciousness, and that people are responding to it in more positive ways?
I think that just the sheer fact of the increase in numbers shows one thing. From 66, as David mentioned, the first year I think it was, to over 500 now across Canada. And I don't know what it'll be this year, because as a result of the Gulf War, people feel even more strongly. I know that people who had never been interested in peace talks before said to me, while the Gulf War was going on, they said, "But I never thought Canada would just get that quickly into war. I thought we were a neutral country." And it astounded them, and they said, "Well, I felt helpless during that time. What can I do?" I now understand, they said to me, why you do the Peace Tax Fund. Of course, your money is speaking for you. It's going to be the thing that matters in this case. So, yes, I think people are making the connection more readily. And you have to also keep in mind, what we're doing in Canada is also going around the world. I mean, several countries now are instituting their own Peace Tax Fund bills. There's one in the States. There's many around the world.
Can you name a few other countries that are involved?
Sweden, Italy, Norway, France, they all have, in one way or another, a movement of peace tax going on.
Do you know the numbers and the increase of the numbers in those countries? Are you aware of the amount of
I don't know the
that
numbers. I know that there have been precedents set, like for example in Italy and in Sweden, both. There have been precedents set for the ways of interpreting the link between money and conscience in terms of military matters. And in the United States, the actual Peace Tax Fund bill has now reached Congress. I mean, it's received a steadily increasing support from the Senate and from the House of Representatives. Both. There are people in it that will support and sponsor that bill.
Well, that sounds great.
Yeah.
It really sounds very encouraging that you don't have to look at something very devastating. It's just making a stand and having your opinion heard in terms of where your taxes need to go.
I think one thing that's really important too is that every person who acts in this way is representing many, many others who aren't able to. Most of the taxpayers in Canada have all their taxes deducted by their employers. And generally the tax that's deducted by their employers is much greater than they actually have to pay. That's why so many people look forward to their tax refund check at the end of the year. The government has collected all that money tax-free and interest-free over the year, and they're getting some money back. So there's very few people who actually owe the government money at the end of the year. And it's those, of that small number of people, those who do act and support the Peace Tax Fund represent a very significant number of people who can't.
Well, what happens that when your employer just takes off the income tax off your paycheck? Can anything be done in terms of that situation?
Well, basically, the amount of tax that is taken off by an employer is, according to the deductions or exemptions that an employee makes at the beginning of the year. For most people, they can't claim any amount of deductions that would reduce it. As many people that have tried to apply to the Revenue Canada, basically to ask for a dispensation, more or less, that they're under hardship to pay all the money in taxes because it goes against their conscience. That's been an argument which hasn't been successful at this point. So basically, until we do have an official Peace Tax Fund, it'll be the actions of people like Irene and many others across the country who have sort of moved it forward and kept it going, so that there's public comment about it and education, and it does seem to be something which is growing. It's very interesting. You were just asking earlier too about countries that have come in support of the Peace Tax Fund, and one thing that comes to mind is just in the last 2 or 3 years in Italy, it's been recognized that, I mean, not necessarily officially, but on an unofficial basis, that people who have paid out money towards a peace tax trust fund type of thing have been able to designate where that money can go rather than the military. It's actually gone towards non-profit groups that support the environment and this type of thing. And it's largely through groups like Conscience Canada that it's possible to learn of those kind of events.
Well, that's very promising. Very promising. I hope to see that our government will listen to us and say, well, yes, you know, your tax dollar can go wherever you think that is best instead of the military. That would be wonderful.
Well, at the present time, Conscience Canada stipulates peace research and peace education as being the place where they want the money to go, and ways to prevent violence. I mean, to research those areas. And I think so their mandate is fairly limited in that sense. It's just a contrast to we don't want to promote violence, we want to promote peace.
Well, we need peace very badly. We can none of us can exist if we don't have that, if we don't work towards that, and if we don't respond in some way to have that happen. You know, I can't see how we can not respond, really. I'm just wondering now, I'm interested to know how all this process can be.
How you do it.
Yeah, how do you do it,
well,
David?
Well, David does my taxes.
Oh,
so
well, there you go.
I would like to say you tell them.
Okay, right. Well, basically what people need to do is just fill out their tax form that they get from the government, just the same way they normally would. And I've actually brought with me a copy of the last page of a tax form here. And what you would basically do is fill it pay. And you would, for 1991, take 8.5% of the amount that you would send to the federal government. That's the military portion of the off 8.5% of the federal taxes, and whatever's left, you send a check for that to the Revenue Canada, to the federal government, and then you send with that check a copy of the check for the Peace Tax Fund and Trust, just so they know that you haven't sent the money.
That you haven't actually withheld taxes, you've diverted that income, that taxes.
It's very important to realize that Conscience Canada is not asking people not to pay their taxes. We're just basically trying to make it very clear that we realize that there's 8.5% for 1991 of our taxes for the federal government has gone towards the military. And so far along, the Canadian government has said, well, we take all of these taxes and we put it all in a great big pot, and then we pull out from there anything we need. And in 1991, 8.5% of that went to the military. Their argument is that when they pull it out, there's no way of designating which person that has come from. That's the argument. Now, my feeling is, and this is a feeling which is shared by many people in the pacifist churches, is that the government has no way of assuring us that the 8.5% that we are spending of the military, that would represent the military portion of our federal taxes, isn't going to the military. So I think we're sort of at loggerheads there. But what we basically do is we make it very clear that we're paying all of our taxes. It's just that the 8.5% military portion is going into a trust fund, and until the government actually institutes some programs officially to allow people and recognize that right of freedom of conscience.
They'll have to think of some kind of program to accommodate people like us that want to have that portion of their dollars to go for peaceful purposes.
Well, I think that's why there's the resistance to it. And it's often commented that that opens up a whole lot of other questions of to what degree should people be allowed to direct their money for different purposes. But I think that one important question or issue in terms of the Peace Tax Fund, at least, is the area of conscience. I mean, that's an area which is enshrined in the guarantee, in the right of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it's not defined. There's been no test to exactly delineate what that means. And until it is, it's a real hot issue.
One more thing to add is that many countries do not have freedom of conscience, do not guarantee it. Canada does. It's one of the few that recognizes both freedom of religion and freedom of conscience.
Well, the reason for that also is that, I mean, the right of pacifist groups for conscientious objection in certain religious churches like the Quakers and the Doukhobors has long been recognized. But there's never been a recognition of the monetary value. In these modern days when so much of the military cost is borne up in equipment and running the whole thing, you know, people aren't putting their lives on the lines. You know, here we spend money instead. And what people are saying who object to their money being used for the military is that our money is doing the killing for us.
That's right. That's right. So I guess, you know, our government has definitely a task before it, you know, to figure out how to solve this kind of a situation, you know. And but I believe that it will be resolved eventually. I have faith in humanity. Really, I do.
Yeah.
Well, I think our program is going to be coming to a close here, and I'd just like to wrap up by saying that I've been really pleased to be here tonight and to have Natalie and David here as well. And for people who are more interested in the subject of how to divert their military taxes, the portion of the taxes they pay every year that goes into fueling the arms race and the violence in the world, we have an address for you at Conscience Canada that you can contact Conscience Canada at. The mailing address is Post Office Box 8601, Victoria Centre Post Office, Victoria, BC, V8W3S2. Thank you.